repeatedly turned towards them with a look of curiosity. Lady Catherine called out, "What is that you are saying, Fitzwilliam? What is it you are talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." "We are speaking of music, madam," said he, when no longer able to avoid a reply. "Of music! Then please speak aloud. I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learned, I should have been a great proficient, and so would Anne, if her health had allowed her to apply. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practices more, and though Mrs. Collins has no instrument, she is very welcome, as I have often told her, to come to Rosings every day and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkinson's room. She would be in nobody's way, you know, in that part of the house." When coffee was over, Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of her promising to play to him, and she sat down directly to the instrument. He drew a chair near her. Lady Catherine listened to half a song and then talked as before to her other nephew, till the latter walked away from her, and making with his usual deliberation towards the pianoforte stationed himself. Elizabeth saw what he was doing, and at first convenient pause, turned to him with a smile, and said, "You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming to hear me?" "I shall not say you are mistaken," he replied. "I know that you find great enjoyment in professing opinions which in fact are not your own." Elizabeth laughed heartily, and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin will teach you not to believe a word I say. I am particularly unlucky in meeting with a person so able to expose my real character. "I am not afraid of you," said he. "I certainly have not the talent which some people possess, of conversing easily with people I have never seen before." Lady Catherine approached, and after listening for a few minutes, said to Darcy, "Miss Bennet would play better if she practised more. She has a very good notion of fingering, though her taste is not equal to Anne's. Anne would have been a delightful performer, if her health allowed her to learn." Chapter 32. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning and writing to Jane while Mrs. Collins and Maria were gone on business into the village, when she was startled by a ring at the door. The certain signal of a visitor, the door opened, and to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Darcy only entered the room. He said that he had hoped to see all the ladies. Then they sat down. It was absolutely necessary before to think of something, so she observed, "How very suddenly you all quitted Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been a most agreeable surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all after him so soon, for if I recollect right, he went but the day before. He and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?" "Perfectly so, I thank you. I think I have understood that Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield again?" "I have never heard him say so, but it is probable that he may spend very little of his time there in the future," said Darcy. "I should not be surprised if he moved as soon as possible." Elizabeth made no answer. She was afraid of talking longer of his friend, and having nothing else to say, was silent. "This seems a very comfortable house, Lady Catherine. I believe did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford." "I believe she did. Mr. Collins appears to be very fortunate in his choice of a wife." "Yes, indeed. His friends may well rejoice. My friend is an excellent wife, I suppose." Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her, and said in a colder voice, "Are you pleased with Kent?" A short dialogue on the subject of the country followed, on either side calm and concise. Charlotte and her sister returned from their walk. Mr. Darcy, after sitting a few minutes longer without saying much to anybody, went away. "What can be the meaning of this?" said Charlotte, as soon as he was gone. "My dear Eliza, he must be in love with you." Why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage it was difficult to understand. He frequently sat there 10 minutes together, without opening his lips, and when he did speak, he spoke very little. Charlotte had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of his loving her, but Elizabeth always laughed at the idea, and Mrs. Collins did not think it right to press the subject. Chapter 33. More than once did Elizabeth, in her walking in the park, unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. How it could occur, therefore, was very odd. Yet it did. He never said much, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking and listening much. But one day, instead of meeting Mr. Darcy, she saw Colonel Fitzwilliam. Forcing a smile, she said, "I did not know before that you ever walked this way." "I have been making the tour of the park," he replied, "as I generally do every year." "Are you going much farther?" "No, I am going to turn in a moment." And they walked towards the parsonage together. "Do you certainly leave Kent on Saturday?" said she. "Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again," replied Colonel Fitzwilliam. "But I am at his disposal. He arranges the business just as he pleases. He likes to have his own way very well, but so we all do. He is rich, and many others are poor. Our habits of expense make us too independent, and there are few people in my rank of life who can afford to marry without some money. In this thought Elizabeth meant for me, and she colored. Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley, and takes care of him. Care of him? Yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care. I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. But I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. What do you mean?" "What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself. He saved a friend from the most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names, and I only suspected it to be Bingley." "Did Mr. Darcy give you reasons for this interference?" "I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady." "And what did he do to separate them?" "He did not tell me," said Fitzwilliam, smiling. "He only told me what I have now told you." Elizabeth made no answer, and walked on, her heart swelling with indignation. After watching her a little, Fitzwilliam asked her why she was so thoughtful. "I am thinking of what you have told me," said she. "Your cousin's behavior does not suit my feelings. I do not see what right Mr. Darcy had to decide for his friend. But," she continued, "as we know nothing, it is not fair to condemn him." They reached the parsonage. There, shut into her own room, as soon as their visitor left them, Elizabeth could think without interruption of all that she had heard. Mr. Darcy separated Bingley and Jane. He was the cause. His pride and caprice were the cause of all that Jane had suffered, and still continued to suffer. He had ruined every hope of happiness for the most affectionate, generous heart in the world. There were some very strong objections against the lady, were Colonel Fitzwilliam's words, and those strong objections probably were, her having one uncle who was a country attorney, and another who was in business in London. To Jane herself she exclaimed, "There could be no objection, all loveliness and goodness as she is. Neither could anything be said against my father." When she thought of her mother, her confidence went away, but she would not allow that any objections there had material for Mr. Darcy. Chapter 34. Elizabeth began to reread all the letters which Jane had written to her. They contained no actual complaint, but in all, and in almost every line of each, there was a lack of something. She could not think of Darcy's leaving Kent without remembering that his cousin was to go with him. But Colonel Fitzwilliam had made it clear that he had no intentions at all, and she did not mean to be unhappy about him. Suddenly she heard the door-bell. She thought that it could be Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, who had once before called late in the evening. But to her utter amazement she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. He sat down for a few moments and then getting up walked about the room. Elizabeth was surprised, but did not say a word. After a silence of several minutes, he came towards her in an agitated manner and thus began. In vain I have struggled. It will not do. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. She started, colored, doubted, and was silent. This he considered sufficient encouragement. He spoke well, but he was not more eloquent on the subject of love than of pride. In spite of her deep dislike, Elizabeth could feel the compliment of such a man's affection, but when he stopped the colour rose into her cheeks, and she said, "I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I am sorry to pain anyone." Mr. Darcy caught her words with surprise. His complexion became pale and with anger, and his disturbance of his mind was visible in every feature. The pause was dreadful to Elizabeth's feelings. Finally, with a voice of forced calmness, he said, "And this is all the reply. I want to know why am I thus rejected? But it is of small importance. Shall I accept the man," replied she, "who has been the means of ruining, perhaps for ever, the happiness of a most beloved sister?" As she pronounced these words Mr. Darcy changed colour, but the emotion was short. She continued, "I have every reason to think ill of you. No motive can excuse the unjust and ungenerous part you acted. You cannot deny that you have been the principal, if not the only means of dividing them from each other." She paused. He looked at her with a smile. "Can you deny that I have done it?" she repeated with assumed tranquillity. He then replied, "I have no wish to deny that did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister. But it is not merely this affair," continued Elizabeth, "on which my dislike is founded. Your character was unfolded in the recital which I received many months ago from Mr. Wickham. What can you say? Who knows what his misfortunes have been?" "His misfortunes," repeated Darcy contemptuously. "Yes, his misfortunes have been great indeed. This is your opinion of me. This is the estimation in which you hold me. I am not ashamed of the feelings I have. They are natural and just. Could you expect me to rejoice in the hope of relations whose condition in life is beneath my own?" Elizabeth felt herself growing more angry every moment, yet she tried to speak calmly. "You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy. I would refuse anyway." Again his astonishment was obvious. She went on, "From the very beginning, from the first moment of my acquaintance with you, your manners impressed me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others. You are the last man in the world whom I could ever marry. You have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings. Forgive me for taking so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness." "Forgive me for taking so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness." And with these words he hastily left the room, and Elizabeth heard him the next moment open the front door and quit the house. Elizabeth sat down and cried for half an hour. She received an offer of marriage from Darcy. He is in love with her. But his pride, his abominable pride, and the manner in which he had mentioned Mr. Wickham, his cruelty towards Jane, tell more than his words of love. Chapter 35. The next morning Elizabeth could not recover from the surprise of what had happened. It was impossible to think of anything else. Soon after breakfast she went for a walk. After walking 2 or 3 times along the part of that lane, she stopped at the gates and looked into the park. Suddenly she noticed a gentleman which was moving that way. It was Mr. Darcy. He was near enough to see her, and stepping forward with eagerness, pronounced her name. He said, "I have been walking in the park in the hope of meeting you. Will you do me the honor of reading the letter?" And then, with a slight bow, was soon out of sight. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter. It was written at 8 o'clock in the morning, and was as follows: "I write without any intention of paining you or humbling myself. You must pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention, but I demand it of your justice. Two offences of a very different nature you last night laid to my charge. The first mentioned was, that I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other, that I had ruined the immediate prosperity of Mr. Wickham. I can only say that I am sorry. I will try to explain everything. In Hertfordshire I saw that Bingley preferred your elder sister to any other young woman in the country. Bingley's attention to your sister had given rise to a general expectation of their marriage. Everybody spoke of it as a certain event. From that moment I observed my friend's behaviour attentively. Your sister I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard, so I thought she was not serious. But of course your superior knowledge of your sister is true, so I can understand I make a terrible error to inflict pain on her. Pardon me. It pains me to offend you. Indeed, I preserved my friend from what I esteemed a most unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following as you, I am certain, remember. In London I tried to tell my friend the certain evils in his choice. I described and enforced them earnestly. To persuade him against returning to Hertfordshire was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. On this subject I have nothing more to say, no other apology to offer. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, please forgive me. With respect to that other, more weighty accusation connected with Mr. Wickham, I can only tell the story of my family. Of what he has particularly accused me I am ignorant, but I will tell you everything. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man, who had for many years the management of all the Pemberley estates, and whose good conduct inclined my father to do him something good. George Wickham was his godson. My father supported him at school, and afterwards at Cambridge. Most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from the extravagance of his wife, was unable to give him a gentleman's education. My father had the highest opinion of him, and hoping the charge would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities which he was carefully hiding from the knowledge of his best friend could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself. Here again I shall give you pain, to what degree you only can tell. My beloved father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was so steady, that in his will he particularly recommended it to me, to promote his advancement, and desired that a valuable family living might be his as soon as it became vacant. There was also an amount of £1,000. His own father did not long survive mine, and within half a year from these events Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that he decided not to become a clergyman. He wanted to receive money, so Mr. Wickham received £3,000 from me. All connection between us dissolved. I thought too ill of him to invite him to Pemberley, or admit his society in town. His life was a life of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him. When the money was over, he wrote that he decided to become a priest and asked me about a place what would suit him. You will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with his entreaty, so he was violent in his abuse of me to others. How he lived I know not, but last summer he again most painfully appeared in my life. I must now mention a circumstance which I would wish to forget myself. My sister, who is more than 10 years younger than me, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago she was taken from school. Last summer she went with the lady to Ramsgate, and there also went Mr. Wickham. He had evil intentions. He offered her to run away with him. My sister was 15 only, which must be her excuse. I am happy to add that I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended escape, and then Georgiana told me everything. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately. Mr. Wickham was interested in my sister's fortune, which is £30,000, but I am sure he was thinking of revenging himself on me. For the truth of everything here related, I can appeal more particularly to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam. I shall find some opportunity of putting this letter in your hands this morning. I will only add, God bless you. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Chapter 36. When Mr. Darcy gave Elizabeth the letter, she had formed no expectation at all of its contents, but she read with eagerness. Mr. Darcy expressed no regret for what he had done. His style was not penitent, not but haughty. It was all pride and insolence. But she was reading about Mr. Wickham. She wished to discredit it entirely, repeatedly exclaiming, "This must be false! This cannot be! This must be the grossest falsehood!" She put down the letter, weighed every circumstance, but with little success. Again she read on, but every line told her that she was wrong about Mr. Wickham. His countenance, voice, and manner had established him at once in the possession of every virtue. She perfectly remembered everything that had passed in conversation between Wickham and herself in their first evening at Mr. Phillips's. Many of his expressions were still fresh in her memory. How differently did everything now appear in which he was concerned! She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling that she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. "How despicably I have acted!" she cried. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment, I, who have valued myself on my abilities. Till this moment I never knew myself." She could not deny the justice of his description of Jane. She felt that Jane's feelings were little displayed. After wandering along the lane for 2 hours, giving way to every variety of thought, reconsidering events, determining probabilities, and reconciling herself, she entered the house with the wish of appearing cheerful as usual. She was immediately told that the two gentlemen from Rosing had each called during her absence, Mr. Darcy only for a few minutes to take leave, But that Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them at least an hour, hoping for her return. Elizabeth could think only of her letter. Chapter 37. The two gentlemen left Rosings the next morning, and Mr. Collins hastened to console Lady Catherine and her daughter. Elizabeth looked at Lady Catherine and thought that she might be her future niece. What would she have said? How would she have behaved? Were questions with which she amused herself. I assure you, no one feels the loss of friends so much as I do, said Lady Catherine. I am particularly attached to these young men, and I know how they are attached to me. They were excessively sorry to go. Lady Catherine observed after dinner that Miss Bennet seemed out of spirits, so she said, "You must write to your mother and beg that you may stay a little longer. Mrs. Collins will be very glad of your company, I am sure." "I am much obliged to your ladyship for your kind invitation," replied Elizabeth, "but it is not in my power to accept it. I must be in town next Saturday. Why, I expected you to stay 2 months. I told Mrs. Collins so before you came. There can be no need for your going so soon. But my father wrote last week to hurry my return. You are all kindness, madam, but I believe I must return home. Lady Catherine said, Mrs. Collins, you must send a servant with them. I cannot bear the idea of two young women travelling by themselves. It is highly improper. You must contrive to send somebody. Young women should always be properly guarded and attended, according to their situation in life. When my niece Georgiana went to Ramsgate last summer, I made a point of her having two men servants go with her. I am excessively attentive to all those things. You must send John with the young ladies, Mrs. Collins. My uncle will send a servant for us." "Oh, your uncle! He keeps a man servant, does he? I am very glad you have somebody who thinks of these things. Where shall you change horses?" "Oh, Bromley, of course." Lady Catherine had many other questions to ask concerning, and as she did not answer them all herself, attention was necessary. Elizabeth studied every sentence of Mr. Darcy's letter, and her feelings toward its writer were all at times widely different. His attachment deserved gratitude, his general character respect, but she could not approve him. In her own past behavior there was a constant source of vexation and regret. Anxiety on Jane's behalf was another concern. How grievous was her fate, when to these recollections was added the development of Wickham's character, it may be easily understood that the happy spirits which had seldom been suppressed before were now so alarming. When they parted, Lady Catherine, with great condescension, wished them a good journey, and invited them to come to Hunsford again next year, and Miss de Bourgh held out her hand to both. Chapter 38. On Saturday morning Elizabeth and Mr. Collins met for breakfast a few minutes before the others appeared, and he took the opportunity of paying their parting civilities. Elizabeth was eager with her thanks and assurances of happiness. She had spent 6 weeks with great enjoyment, and the pleasure of being with Charlotte, and the kind of attention she had received, must make her feel of the obliged. Mr. Collins was gratified, and with a more smiling solemnity, replied, "It gives me great pleasure to hear that you have passed your time not disagreeably. We have certainly done our best. You may, in fact, carry a very favourable report of us into Hertfordshire, my dear cousin." Elizabeth could safely say that it was a great happiness to meet them here. Poor Charlotte! It was melancholy to leave her to such society, but she had chosen it with her eyes open, and she did not seem to ask for compassion. Her home and her housekeeping, her parish and her poultry, and all their dependent concerns had not yet lost their charms. At length the chaise arrived, the trunks were fastened on, the parcels placed within, and it was pronounced to be ready. "Good gracious!" cried Maria, after a few minutes' silence, "it seems but a day or two since we first came, and yet how many things have happened!" "A great many indeed," said her companion with a sigh. "We have dined 9 times at Rosings, besides drinking tea there twice. How much I shall have to tell," Elizabeth added privately, "and how much I shall have to conceal." Their journey was performed without much conversation, and within 4 hours of their leaving Hunsford they reached Mr. Gardiner's house, where they were to remain a few days. Jane looked well, and Elizabeth had little opportunity of studying her spirits, but Jane was to go home with her, and at Longbourn there would be time enough for observation. Chapter 39. After welcoming their sisters, Kitty and Lydia triumphantly displayed a table set out with cold meat. "Is not this nice? Is not this an agreeable surprise? Look here, I have bought this bonnet," added Lydia. "I do not think it is very pretty, but I decided to buy it anyway. I shall pull it to pieces as soon as I get home, and see if I can make it better. You know, the officers are going to leave Meryton in a fortnight." "Are they indeed?" cried Elizabeth, with the greatest satisfaction. "They are going to Brighton, and I do so want papa to take us all there for the summer. It would be such a delicious plan, and I dare say would not cost anything at all. Only think what a miserable summer else we shall have." "Now I have got some news for you," said Lydia, as they sat down at table. "What do you think? It is excellent news, capital news, and about a certain person we all like." Jane and Elizabeth looked at each other, and the waiter was told he need not stay. Lydia laughed and said, "You thought the writer must not hear, as if he cared. I dare say he often hears worse things said than I am going to say. But he's an ugly fellow. I'm glad he's gone. I never saw such a long chin in my life. Well, it is about dear Wickham. There is no danger of Wickham's marrying Mary King. She is gone down to her uncle at Liverpool, gone to stay. Wickham is safe." "And Mary King is safe too," added Elizabeth. "She is a great fool for going away, if she liked him. But I hope there is no strong attachment on either side," said Jane. "I am glad bought by Bonnet," cried Lydia. "And in the first place let us hear what has happened to you all since you went away. Have you seen any pleasant men? Have you had any flirting? I was in great hopes that one of you would have got a husband before you came back. Jane will be an old maid soon, I declare. She is almost 23." Mrs. Bennet rejoiced to see Jane, and more than once during dinner did Mr. Bennet say voluntarily to Elizabeth, "I am glad you are come back, Lizzie." Their party in the dining-room was large, for almost all the Lucases came to meet Maria and hear the news. Lydia seldom listened to anybody for more than half a minute. In the afternoon Lydia was urgent with the rest of the girls to walk to Meryton and to see how everybody went on, but Elizabeth steadily opposed the plan. Miss Bennet dreaded seeing Mr. Wickham again, and was resolved to avoid it as long as possible. Chapter 40. Elizabeth's impatience to acquaint Jane with what happened could no longer be overcome, and she related to her the next morning the scene between Mr. Darcy and herself. "His sureness of succeeding was wrong," said she, "but consider how much it must increase this disappointment." "Indeed," replied Elizabeth, "I am heartily sorry for him. but he has other feelings which will probably soon drive away his regard for me. You do not blame me, however, for refusing him. Blame you? Oh no, but you will know it when I tell you what happened the very next day. She then spoke of the letter, repeating the whole of its contents. What a stroke was this for poor Jane! It was some time, however, before Jane could smile. I did not know when I was more shocked, said she. Wickham is so bad, poor Mr. Darcy. Dear Lizzie, only consider what he must have suffered. Such a disappointment. And poor Wickham, there is such an expression of goodness in his countenance, such an openness and gentleness in his manner. Lizzie, when you first read that letter, I am sure you could not treat the matter as you do now. Indeed, I could not. I was uncomfortable enough, I may say unhappy, and there was no Jane to comfort me. Oh, how I wanted you! Elizabeth became calm. She had got rid of two of the secrets which had troubled her for a long time, but she noticed that Jane was not happy. She still loved Bingley. "Well, Lizzie," said Mrs. Bennet one day, "what is your opinion now of this sad business of Jane's? For my part, I am determined never to speak of it again to anybody. Well, he is a very undeserving young man. There is no talk of his coming to Netherfield again in the summer, and I have inquired of everybody, too, who is likely to know. I do not believe he will ever like at Netherfield any more. Oh, well, it is just as he chooses. Nobody wants him to come." Elizabeth made no answer. "Well, Lizzie," continued her mother, soon afterwards, "and so the Collinses live very comfortable, do they? Well, well, I only hope it will last. And what sort of table do they keep? Charlotte is an excellent manager, I dare say. If she is half as sharp as her mother, she is saving enough. There is nothing extravagant in their housekeeping, I dare say. No, nothing at all. A great deal of good management. Yes, yes. They will take care not to outrun their income. They will never be distressed for money. And so, I suppose, they often talk of having Longbourn when your father is dead. I say, whenever that happens, it was a subject which they could not mention before me. I make no doubt they often talk of it between themselves.